My name is Joyce Miller. I'm 34 years old and live with my daughter in Columbus, Ohio. I used to be the wife of Isaac Miller, a well-known tech entrepreneur in the local startup scene. We first met when I was 24, both attending a business development course. At that time, Isaac was preparing to launch his own company, while I had just left a finance firm that had gone bankrupt. We started from scratch. The company's first office was just a rented room behind an old bookstore. I handled all the administrative and accounting tasks myself, even filing for business permits and building the initial workflow. Meanwhile, Isaac was in charge of fundraising and expanding the market. Though I didn't have an official title, I worked full-time for the company for over 6 years. When the company began turning a profit and hired its own management team, I stepped back to focus on raising our family. We had a daughter, Amelia. Life seemed to be entering a stable phase, but in reality it was quite the opposite. The relationship between Isaac and me started to show cracks. Our conversations became fewer. Dinners were filled with silence, and I no longer received invitations to company meetings I used to attend. At first, I thought it was just work pressure or differences in parenting styles. But over time I realized it was a permanent shift. Isaac began coming home late, using a separate phone and avoiding serious conversations. When I brought up the idea of redefining my role in the company, he curtly told me I was no longer aligned with the new vision and should focus on being a homemaker. I tried to save our relationship. I suggested marriage counseling, taking a short trip together to reconnect. But he turned down every idea. Each time I made a suggestion, he'd either claim he was too busy or say, "Everything's fine. You're just too sensitive." Until one evening I accidentally came across a text exchange between Isaac and a woman named Kelsey, someone newly hired to the communications team. The messages weren't overtly explicit, but they were enough for me to know they had crossed the line. I didn't make a scene. Instead, I quietly gathered more information, checking schedules, credit card statements, and consulting my personal lawyer. Just a few weeks later, Isaac was the one who brought up divorce. He said we had both changed too much and were no longer compatible. The reason was vague, but I didn't argue. I knew it was only a matter of time. The divorce was finalized rather quickly. I was granted custody of our daughter, but all I received in the settlement was a small amount of cash and a used car. I had no shares in the company, no benefits tied to the years I had contributed. In the agreement, my name wasn't mentioned as a co-founder or even a consultant, even though I had done nearly everything to help the company run. At our final meeting to sign the paperwork, Isaac looked at me and said something I'll never forget. "Joyce, you need to accept the truth. Without me, you are nothing." I didn't respond. I just signed the papers and walked out of that office, carrying a handbag, a few sets of clothes, and my 6-year-old daughter asleep in the car. After the divorce, I rented a small 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building, close to my daughter's elementary school. It wasn't the ideal neighborhood. The heating system sometimes failed in the winter, and the parking lot flooded whenever it rained heavily. But the rent fit what little savings I had left. I began reworking my resume. In many of the applications I sent out, my 6 years working for Isaac's company were reduced to a brief line: Internal Administrative Manager, 6 years. I had no official title, no company email address, and no way to prove most of what I had done. Nothing in my hands but a few internal emails and some invoices I had once handled. Most employers rejected me after the initial screening. A few invited me to interviews, but once I mentioned I'd taken a few years off to raise my daughter and lacked formal degrees in finance or management, the conversations usually ended within minutes. I understood what they were looking for: someone with specific measurable skills. Me. On paper, I was just a divorced woman who had worked in an unofficial role and was now trying to re-enter the workforce at 34. At one point, I considered taking a part-time waitressing job or signing up for food delivery work. But my daughter's school schedule and the need to care for her outside of school made that difficult. I had no close relatives nearby. My parents had passed away and my younger brother was living in Seattle. I had to manage everything on my own. On many evenings after my daughter fell asleep, I'd sit by a small wooden table next to the window, open my old laptop and write in a journal. I listed every skill I had ever used: handling internal budgets, managing office lease contracts, overseeing the marketing team, drafting investor reports. I didn't have an MBA, but I had personally managed nearly every administrative aspect of a startup, from zero revenue to a formal office and almost 30 employees. I began rewriting all of those experiences into short posts and sharing them on LinkedIn. My initial goal was simply to practice writing and connect with others who had worked in startups. I didn't expect much. But after a few weeks, one of my posts, about common financial mistakes in the pre-funding stage, unexpectedly gained hundreds of shares and comments. A few small business owners messaged me for more details. They were curious about my experience and asked for advice. Some invited me for coffee, others emailed to ask if I offered consulting. At first, I declined. I didn't think I was qualified. But then a woman in her 40s, who was running a struggling bakery, called me directly. She said she didn't need someone brilliant, just someone who could listen and had been through what she was facing. I said yes. We met at a small cafe and I spent nearly 3 hours helping her analyze cash flow, identify unnecessary expenses and restructure her pricing. Afterward, she handed me an envelope with $100 and a note. It's not much, but it's what I believe you deserve. That evening I came home, looked at the bill, and for the first time in months I felt valuable again. After receiving my first consulting fee, I began getting a few more clients. Mostly middle-aged women running small shops or family businesses. They didn't need global-scale strategies. They just wanted to understand how to manage cash flow, reorganize staff schedules, optimize cost of goods, or rebuild their operating budgets. And I realized I was perfectly capable of doing those things. I didn't advertise my services. Every referral came from personal conversations and the weekly posts I continued sharing. My posts never talked about my past with Isaac or the details of our ended marriage. I only wrote about work, the mistakes I had made, common pitfalls in running small businesses, and how a woman without formal qualifications could still manage effectively by observing, documenting, and learning from real-world experience. One day in early October, I received an email from an organization called the National Women's Leadership Collective, a network that connects women entrepreneurs across the U.S. The email was from Margot Klein, one of their program directors. She wrote that she had been following my posts for over 2 months and was impressed by how I analyzed small business operations. She invited me to be a guest speaker at their annual conference, scheduled for November in Chicago. I read that email at least 5 times. My first emotion wasn't excitement, it was doubt. I had never spoken in front of a crowd. I wasn't a certified expert. I was just a single mother trying to rebuild her life after a divorce. But Margot didn't stop at the invitation. She included a formal letter of invitation, a list of last year's speakers, and a suggested topic for my talk. Rebuilding a career after personal upheaval, a practical perspective. I sent a thank you note and asked for a few days to think it over. During that time, I spoke with a few close clients, asking what they thought if I gave a speech at a major conference. They all supported the idea. I accepted the invitation. During the preparation process, I rewrote my speech as a story. Not exaggerated, not self-deprecating, and without diving into the details of my past marriage. I simply shared my journey, from someone in the background once pushed aside, to someone who stood up and rebuilt her worth in her own way. I practiced each night after my daughter went to bed. I recorded myself and listened repeatedly, adjusting my words, tone, and pacing. A few days before the conference, I received the official event schedule. In the list of companies exhibiting at the Side Expo, I saw a familiar name, Miller Tech Group, the company I had once quietly helped build. Beside the company name was the listed representative, Isaac Miller. I sat in silence for a few minutes, not out of fear or surprise, but because for the first time in nearly 2 years, I knew I would come face to face with the man who once said I was nothing without him. And this time the circumstances had changed. The conference took place at a large hotel in downtown Chicago. I arrived a day early to prepare and familiarize myself with the venue. The organizers arranged a private room for me to rest and rehearse. The room was simple but cozy, with a desk facing the street and a small shelf filled with books on leadership, startups, and women in business. The next morning, I woke up at 6, had a light breakfast, and spent nearly an hour reviewing my entire speech. Even though I had rehearsed thoroughly, I still felt nervous. When I entered the main hall, most of the seats were already filled. The lighting was soft. Gentle background music played. Some attendees were already seated, flipping through the event program in their hands. The organizers guided me to the stage through a private entrance. In that moment, I saw Isaac standing near the exhibition booths on the far right side of the hall. He wore a gray suit and was speaking with a group of people, perhaps partners or staff. From a distance, I couldn't read the expression on his face. But just a few seconds later, our eyes met. The event coordinator stepped onto the stage and briefly introduced me. Joyce Miller, founder of a practical consulting service for women-led businesses. I walked up. I began my talk with a simple sentence. I was once the woman behind a business whose name was never mentioned. The room fell silent. I continued, not reading from paper but speaking from memory, and from the life I had lived. I shared how I once believed I was simply supporting, just helping someone with vision. I spoke about walking away with nothing but a 6-year-old child, and the quiet nights I spent rewriting mental notes just to remember what I had once done. I spoke about my first client, my first blog post, and the first time I realized, real worth doesn't come from being credited, it comes from not giving up. I didn't talk about Isaac. I didn't mention the name of the old company. I didn't use the past to assign blame. Everything I said focused on what I had learned, what I had come to understand after starting over. That many of the women sitting in that room might be in the same place. Once doubted, once overlooked. I looked down. I couldn't make out every face, but I saw Margot, the woman who had invited me, standing and nodding. And across the hall, Isaac was still there. He showed no clear reaction. Just stood still, holding a cup of coffee, eyes fixed on the stage. I stepped down. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was behind anyone anymore. That afternoon, after my speech, I didn't return to the stage. I was invited to a tea reception for speakers and special guests. But I politely left early. I wanted to spend the rest of the day walking through the old neighborhood, near the university where I once studied economics. Back when I believed every plan could be written neatly on paper. On my way back to the hotel, I stopped by an old bookstore. I bought a notebook and a fountain pen, not because I needed to write, but because I wanted to mark something that had started, right where I once thought things had ended. That night, I FaceTimed my daughter. She proudly told me her teacher had put a gold star on her math assignment. I told her that Mommy also had a gold star day. She giggled. In her eyes, all important things begin with something that small. The next morning, before catching my flight back to Ohio, I received a message from an unknown number, no name saved. The message said only one line. Your speech was better than anything I ever thought of you. I knew who it was. And I didn't reply. I didn't need validation from the past. I wasn't waiting for recognition from someone who once believed I couldn't exist without him. My new life wasn't built around proving anything to him. Everything I have now isn't an act of revenge. When I returned home, our small apartment, the one my daughter and I shared, no longer felt like a temporary pause. It was the place where I had rebuilt everything from the ground up, with my own hands. I continued my consulting work, but didn't scale up too quickly. I chose to keep it small, just enough clients so I could still have time for my daughter, for myself, and for quiet mornings with a cup of coffee. My life now doesn't have dramatic turns. No headlines. No social media buzz. I still write regularly. The posts are no longer to seek attention, but to capture what I've learned from each project, each conversation. And sometimes someone messages me to say thank you, just because a single paragraph made them see their own situation a little differently. I don't know who I'll be in 5 years or where this career will take me, but I do know this. I no longer live in anyone's shadow, and sometimes that's enough.